we're now in a situation 2 years in a war of attrition with Russia. President Obama himself said that the Russians care more about Ukraine than the Americans do. And the Russians have succeeded. Their army is larger than it was at the beginning of the war, according to General Cavoli.
Yeah.
Their military industry has been revitalized, unfortunately. And now we're escalating the conflict.
Well, today I can welcome the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Elbridge Colby, who was tipped by many to become maybe National Security Advisor to Donald Trump if he becomes president in this election. Welcome to the program to you, Mr. Colby.
Well, great to be with you. I don't make that claim, but honored to serve in President Trump's administration, his first one. So,
well, I've heard you described in that way and read you described in that way in quite a few places. Now, can I just start with you? And again, welcome to the program. With what is going on in New York City, it is hard to imagine a more consequential court case than we're seeing there now. The jury has now been sent out, and we've seen how that case has polarized opinion with rival demonstrators right there on the spot, and no doubt, differences of view, sharp differences across the country. Would a conviction there, do you think, perhaps be a big problem for your man, for the Trump campaign? Would it maybe repel some Republicans and independents?
Well, I'm not really my focus on the legal issues, but I think
sure.
the wide view among Republicans is that these prosecutions, including this prosecution in New York, is extremely superficial and thin, and I think the Republican Party and in fact the majority of voters in polls right now support President Trump's candidacy and support his. His defense. So, I'm sure there are others who you can get who would speak more to the legal issues.
Yeah. So without getting into the legal ins and outs, and I recognize you're not involved, you're not in that part of the campaign that is concerned with all of that, but it is.
And I should say I don't represent or I speak for the campaign or for
sure.
President Trump. So, I'm supporting him certainly, but enthusiastically. But
I mean, as you look at it as a seasoned observer, though, do you imagine that case could conceivably lead, because this is a focus of attention, obviously, on this side of the Atlantic and around the world. I mean, do you imagine a jail sentence, a finding of guilt in that case? We don't know what will happen. There's no verdict yet. But do you imagine it could lead to disorder on the streets?
I honestly, sir, I'm sorry. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. I thought I was coming on to talk about, foreign policy issues and so forth. As I said, I support President Trump. I think this case is very, very weak. Obviously there have been reports about demonstrations and so forth, but I just don't have any depth on it. I wouldn't be an asset to your listeners to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I recognize you're not immersed in that field, but it is so much a focus of news attention in this country. I was keen to sort of put those points to you. Let us talk about the area in which you have great expertise, starting with security, Western security. Do you believe that we can now rule out any possibility of the United States quitting NATO if Donald Trump becomes president for a second time?
Well, I mean, I think President Trump has spoken, of his own words on that topic, and he said that NATO needs to step up. I mean, my own view, I'll speak for myself, is, and again, I don't speak for President Trump.
Sure.
My own view is that NATO is a very important alliance for the United States, and I'd say even more for Europe. But NATO needs to adapt and reform to survive and thrive, and that's just a matter of structural necessity, as I wrote in the Financial Times last week.
Yeah.
NATO basically and Europe need to step up if this transatlantic alliance survives. So I would urge people to look less at the Americans and what they're saying and more to your own house. The United Kingdom significantly reduced the size of its military, particularly under Prime Minister Cameron. It's got a lot of backlog. Obviously, the Sunak government has talked about a 2.5% commitment. I understand Mr. Starmer is also committed to that. I think it's that would probably be just a starting point. I mean, if you look at Poland, they're spending 4%. I think unfortunately Europe is going to have to reinvigorate its military. As the United Kingdom has maintained more of a military than most other countries in Europe, but I think given the threat that the Russians pose, and the fact that the Americans, we really have to focus more on Asia. It's going to really fall much more on Europe's shoulders. So I'd urge Europeans to kind of look to your own house first on this score.
Yeah.
Get down to business.
It is right, isn't it, that an American president has pretty wide-ranging powers when it comes to relationships governed by treaty. But to leave NATO, it couldn't just be on the say-so of the president in any case.
Well, I mean, I think there's been some legislation on that issue. I mean, I don't think that's a live issue. As I said, I think it makes sense for the United States to stay in NATO. I think more the question probably would be, what exactly can the United States pledge to NATO? If you look at the Washington Treaty, it's not a suicide pact for the member states. It obligates the committing states to come to the defense of others and to regard an attack on one as an attack on all, but consistent with our own constitutional processes and implicitly our strategic requirements. So I think my own view, what I would recommend, whatever position I may or may not be in, or from the outside or whatever, I would recommend the United States provide such forces to Europe as would not compromise our ability to defeat Chinese attack along the first island chain of an ally. In that context, and that might be less than Europeans are hoping for or expecting. I mean, this is something I've certainly been talking about in the last 6 or 7 years in and out of government, but I think that's sort of the reality of the situation we're in right now. The United States does not have a multi-front military. Senator Roger Wicker of the Armed Services Committee, ranking Republican, wrote a piece in the New York Times talking about the difficulties our military is facing today. So I think that's just the reality of the situation we're in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the focus of NATO and of the Western partners is very much on Ukraine. You yourself have been very critical, haven't you, of British ministers, especially Lord Carrington, Lord Cameron, David Cameron, telling Republicans, the way that he did quite recently, to back Ukraine, to learn the lessons of World War II when it came to dealing with Germany. Do you feel the same way now? Because there have been reports since then of David Cameron maybe mending fences on your side with Donald Trump and and those surrounding him. Do you feel the same way about that?
Well, I mean, based on what Mr. Cameron has said and his public positions, and the fact that he's even gone so far as to be one of the first to call for the use of British weapons against internationally recognized Russian territory, I think my comments do hold, and especially pointed when it was under Mr. Cameron's government that the British military cut. I mean, he said when he was in Kiev that the United Kingdom is tapped out with £3 billion a year in military support. Well, the United States has provided above $170 billion.
Yes.
So $3 billion pounds, unfortunately, is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
I think we're going to need a lot greater level of seriousness. I think we need a lot more walking the walk and less talking the talk. And there's a lot of discussion of, and I have a sort of a similar view on some of President Macron's comments about French troops going into Ukraine. I mean, there is a lot of flapping of wings in Europe and relatively little follow through. Actually, to their credit, the government in Germany and certainly the government in places like Poland seems to be doing more. But I'd rather see from the United Kingdom less aggressive rhetoric and policy, and certainly a less intrusive attitude within our own domestic political sphere. Yes. And more of a focus on delivering, on sort of walking that walk. And that's kind of the core of my objection to Cameron's comments. I found it not only wrong in principle, but I think especially difficult to swallow, being lectured by somebody, whose policy has contributed to the parlous state of the British Armed Forces. And I don't say that with any disrespect. I think that's just an acknowledged fact. The United Kingdom, I mean, the carrier is not fielding an air wing. I believe it's the smallest British army since, I don't know, Cromwell or before. This is not a good situation. I think that's where, the United States should want the United Kingdom to focus, and less on trying to move the escalation threshold in Ukraine, or come here and really kind of browbeat skeptical people on the Republican side, which is the majority of Republicans at this point.
Right. I mean, you pick out the comment from Lord Cameron that Ukraine would be free to fire weapons into Russian territory, and that's been echoed in a sense by Antony Blinken, President Biden's Secretary of State. He said he's not recommending that, but he said Ukraine, if they choose to do that, that's a matter for them. Can I take it from what you're saying? You would reverse that policy, given the power and the opportunity to do that. You would, as it were, tell Ukraine with American weapons you could not use them in that way to attack Russian territory.
Well, that has been our policy, as I understand it, for the last 2 years. And what really disturbs me about the situation is the sort of blithe and kind of insouciant way in which our governments collectively are sort of tiptoeing into a significant escalation that the Russians have noticed, not only Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, but Putin himself the other day. And that's not, I'm not saying this because I like Putin or what Russia is doing. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine is evil. But I thought it had been learned, quote unquote, in the Cold War that we should be very careful about the possibility of direct confrontation with a nuclear weapon state that has an arsenal of 6,000 nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And in a situation in which the war is not going particularly well, when we, the Americans and the Brits, fought in Korea, we did not attack targets north of the Yalu, and even though the Chinese and the Soviets were supporting the effort, we were very careful in the context of Vietnam not to attack into China and so forth, because we were rightly, not because we thought that the communist Chinese or Soviets were the good guys or some kind of cartoonish characterization, but this is an exceptionally dangerous situation in which this is a threshold that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany and others have themselves acknowledged. I'm not saying that that's fixed in heaven or some platonic reality, but there's this is where I am very concerned about the Vietnam analogy, where we had a very tragic experience of kind of step by step falling further and further into a quagmire, and the consequences of a war with Russia today are far graver than they were when 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
But we're now in a situation 2 years in a war of attrition with Russia. President Obama himself said that the Russians care more about Ukraine than the Americans do. And the Russians have succeeded. Their army is larger than it was at the beginning of the war, according to General Cavoli.
Yeah.
Their military industry has been revitalized, unfortunately. And now we're escalating the conflict. What is the strategic logic? I've been telling American reporter friends and putting it on Twitter. Has the administration clarified this? This is a potentially epochal decision. Because here's the other thing, people discount the Russian nuclear threats. I personally think Russian nuclear threats should be taken seriously, but we should not be sort of, if you will, use an old-fashioned word, kind of unmanned or discombobulated by them, but we need to take them seriously. But the Russian counter threat to what Cameron said was not necessarily with nuclear forces. It said they would target allied assets or capabilities either within Ukraine or beyond, which, if you think about it, is a relatively credible threat. That's not saying he's going to blow up the whole world. Now, they also ordered, for I believe the first time since the Cold War, exercises with their tactical nuclear weapon systems. So, the problem here, another historical analogy, is the Americans, we discounted the warnings that the Chinese would intervene in Korea until it happened. And it was cataclysmic for us in November of 1950. This is a situation in which, yes, people are saying the Russians haven't escalated, but that doesn't mean they're not going to, and that there couldn't be consequences for us. But at the bare minimum, what I would expect is a forthright discussion of these issues. Are our societies prepared for the potential for direct intervention?
Yes.
I don't think that it makes sense for the United States, at least, to directly intervene into Ukraine. What happens if the Russians do attack allied targets outside of Ukraine? Have we got a clear policy on that? This is a very dangerous situation.
Well, I was really keen to get your views on that, so thank you for explaining that so fully. I must ask